Welcome to the Emergent Leadership Panel. I am so excited about this conversation. We have got some incredible leaders and trainers of leaders here to have just a really meaningful conversation and get your questions answered, hopefully, about what does it mean to lead in an emergent environment that we are all in. So I am Maria Kingery. I am co-founder of Southern Energy Management, which has been a B Corp since 2009. And I also work with Mel at a company called 360 Rocks, where we help with strategy and execution for sustainable-minded businesses. And emergent leadership is one of my passions right now, and it's being defined. And so to have this panel together to talk about what that looks like, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, a year ago, we thought we could make plans and that we could follow, exact plans. And now we all know that that is not actually the case. And so this whole concept of how do we lead through change and enduring change in a really powerful way. And we've got some great experts here to have that conversation. So Laura Huckabee-Jennings, if you want to wave to us, Laura, I guess everybody can see your name, is CEO at Transcend. And you guys, I'm not going to read the whole bios. You guys can read these, please do. But one of what struck me about Laura's bio was she identifies the one limiting factor that keeps teams from being productive and successful as possible, and that is fear. And I had a conversation with a group this morning that would indicate that is true. So I'm excited to learn from you, Laura. Beth Offenbacker, Dr. Beth, I think we can call her, is an executive leadership coach and consultant with Waterford, Inc. And she focuses on helping with emotional intelligence and inclusive leadership, which if ever there was a time that we can learn more about that, now is a great time. Steve Linton, a fellow North Carolinian and someone I've admired from afar for a long time, is the president of Deltec Homes and chief steward of its greater cause and purpose, which I love. That's what he cares about. Deltec crafts homes that blur the lines between indoors and out, allowing homeowners to feel connected to the natural world around them. I just want to say those words.
Excuse me, Maria, I think some of us are having a challenge hearing you.
You got very quiet.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, you can hear me now. All right, well okay, all right. I don't know if that's on my end, but anyway, okay. Did you hear what Steve's awesome purpose, what their company does, which is blurring the lines between indoors and out, helping homeowners to feel connected to the natural world around them. And that sounds really good about right now, Steve, I would say. And then last but certainly not least is Rachel Hardy. And Rachel is co-founder of Open Eye Creative, which is a certified B Corporation that specializes in telling the stories of other awesome companies. And Rachel, her one-liner that I had to pull out, believes that in a world of relentless distractions, listening is the ultimate differentiator. So, can you guys, I just got note that my volume seems to be low. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Goes back and forth.
It does.
It's a little muffled.
I sound muffled. That's never good. Muffled is never going to. Okay. Well, I tell you what, I'm going to turn it over. We're going to start the conversation, and I will work on my volume while I throw out some questions to our panel. And just so you know, guys, we decided to have this as a conversation so that you can really learn from our experts here instead of like formal presentations. So the first question that I want to throw out there is, we talk a lot about inclusivity and transparency. Why is it important to be transparent with our teams, and like what benefit does that give us? And Laura, I'll start with you, and then Beth, Rachel, Steve.
So transparency is critical for developing trust. And so what you really want for your teams to be engaged and to bring their all is for them to feel like they're in an environment where their well-being is being considered and that they are valued as human beings. And when we're transparent with them about what's happening, what isn't happening, where things are going, we build trust with our teams. And so that's just foundational for building any kind of high-performing organization, is that you build a high-trust environment, building psychological safety, really feeling like there's not a lot of hidden agendas. So that's what I would say, is that it's critical for trust.
And absolutely, I agree with Laura. And to build on her comments, there's a emotional intelligence community that I'm a practitioner with, and they have a formula that they use. It's the community is called 6 Seconds. Encourage you to check them out. They talk about the 4 components of trust being commitment, caring, consistency, and competence. And so it requires those 4 elements. And I would probably go a little bit further and say that it requires something that is really hard for people who are in positions of authority. And I suffer from this just as much as everyone else here. It's the ability to show our vulnerability and to connect with humility. And when we can do that and show people that we are real, we're authentic, we have bumps and scrapes just like everybody else. Believe it or not, it's counterintuitive, but that actually builds trust among people. So it's a combination of all those factors, I would say.
I'm really curious to ask you all, to ask the panelists and Maria and anyone listening, if they want to drop their comments in the chat, and maybe we can get to this at the end, but I'm curious if you think transparency, in what cases it can be not good. In which cases can it be detrimental? So I want to put that out there. I don't have anything else to add. I mean, definitely I agree with Laura and Beth. They made some really good points, but that's something that came up for me when just thinking about this topic.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel, for that. And that's, you're living exactly how I hope this conversation will go. Like, it doesn't have to be, it can be very organic. So Steve, if you want to respond to that, or I see Laura's got something to add as well.
Sure, yeah. So I think that Beth and Laura did a good job of setting the stage on the trust piece. I think one thing that I'll add on transparency is those of us who are leaders, the higher we go in the organization, the more likely we are to deceive ourselves. So we might think that we understand the world in one way, but chances are that the people who are wanting transparency are looking at things totally differently. So this is not a binary equation. It's not like, oh, I just need to share more information with more people and the problem is solved. Not at all. You have to figure out how to kind of decenter yourself and almost put yourself in the shoes of everybody else. And I think it kind of gets to Rachel's point, like, I don't think everybody needs to know everything, but I don't think there should be barriers for people to know what they need to know. And those two things can be really hard to tease apart sometimes. So I'll maybe throw that out to the panel to further the conversation.
I'll just briefly, in my experience, there are things that people don't really want to know. They think they do, and then they don't. But yeah, Laura, I'm interested.
I totally agree with what Rachel and Steve have said, is that we have to be very strategic about which things people care about and what they're going to want to share with them. And if we share our everyday angst about, I don't know how I'm going to make this decision, you share too much of your indecision, they might feel like perhaps you're not competent or the ship's not steady. And so we don't want to give people a sense that we're not confident, that we're not working through things. But to add the vulnerability back from Beth's comment is that, we also have to admit that we don't know all the answers, but we're working on them. And here's how we're going to get to them. And here's the things that are important for people to know. And here's how they can contribute to being part of that solution. And a timeline, expectation setting, just so that, they don't expect us to have all the answers. And certainly we don't need to share everything with them. It's overwhelming to overshare and give them too much detail. But at a high level, they should be able to understand what's happening. And if they have specific questions about other things, I feel like you should be as open as you can. I think of it a little bit about sex ed with children is you should answer the question they asked. and not go like 3 levels deeper. So understand what your employees are looking for and answer their specific questions and make sure you're alleviating their fears and uncertainty.
Well, I do think there's a piece here around our purpose orientation. I was listening to a webinar the other day and with some researchers talking about the value of that. And, especially in our community, that's something that pulls us forward. And what are those points that we can meaningfully engage people with sincerity around continuing to create the purpose for the organization and to serve our customers, our clients, in a way that's grounded in our values, right? And so looking for those points of intersection, I think that's what we're asked to do. And so I think Steve's point is right on, like, where are those intersections and where does it make sense to pull somebody in so we can co-create something? Sometimes it's a transactional thing. You're like, here's what you need. But really where the power is in keeping teams engaged and people excited about working with us on a lot of levels is saying, how can we do this together, right? In ways that are sustainable in all of the good ways, right?
I love what you just said, Beth, and I'm a huge fan of distributed leadership is how I think about it, right? And just distributed decision making. And, I'm curious, there is that line, though, as Laura brought up, between being transparent and vulnerable. And since you brought up vulnerable, I wonder if you can say a few more words about, like, how do we navigate that line as leaders? Because, there are, wherever we are in the organization, we have different vulnerabilities and being sensitive to the vulnerabilities of others while managing our own. Just wonder if you can say something about that.
Well, I think this is where leadership self-awareness is so important. And it's being able to say, I messed up, right? And I'm always learning. I think about this all the time in my social justice work. I'm trying to understand someone else's perspective or their lens that they bring, how they look at the world, and how can I respect them and engage that conversation, and realizing I bring my own perspectives and experiences. So I think there's also a piece around not always having the answers, too. As somebody who loves to learn stuff, heaven knows, there's stuff that I don't know that each of you know, and I think that's pretty cool. And to not wear my ego on my shoulders, but come with a heart-centered approach is, I think, those are some of the observations that I have. I'm really curious how everyone else thinks about that question.
Yeah, thank you for that, Beth and Laura and Rachel. I have to come to you now because listening seems to be such a critical part of this.
Yeah, I totally agree, Maria. And something, that I was thinking about as Beth was talking is I think as leaders, we get into this mode where if we don't know the answer, and very often we don't, right? We're just kind of like, that's the direction I'm going to go in. I don't know if it's right, but I am going to step forward as if it were right. It can be hard to balance it with that humility and vulnerability. And, the impulse to be like, this is it, this is where I'm going. And it's saying like, I'm not quite sure. And when to do that, I think is a really delicate, tricky thing. But in terms of listening, my background is in journalism and filmmaking. And so that's the perspective that I am coming from. And I believe that really being present with people, when we talk to them, totally limiting distractions and giving them our full attention is a sign of great respect. And I believe that is one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the most important ways, in my opinion, to build that trust between two people. And I can certainly talk more about that, but when we have these conversations, that's where my mind goes, is to how can you build that like genuine connection with people on your team so that they can then trust you and feel empowered to lead themselves.
Yeah, I would love to hear the panel's response to that as well, because and I'm curious about, like, are there structures? So one of the things my teams as an EOS implementer is work to set up structures so that you provide opportunities for engagement and for this co-creation that I heard you guys talking about. I love some either, yeah.
Maria, you broke up on the second half of that. Do you mind repeating that statement or question?
I'm the best moderator ever, right? You can hear me. And what I was saying was like, are there ways that we can intentionally design our organizations to create this type of listening and this co-creation that you guys are, which I believe will inherently build trust, right?
So I can speak to some of the structures that we use. It's when we talk about leading teams is every person does their own one-on-ones once a month where the other person gets to have the agenda and talk about whatever it is that they want to talk about. What are you concerned about? What can we do to support you better? What are you loving about what you're doing right now? What is maybe challenging you? And it's a listening exercise. And then it gives you some guidance as to where you might need to add resources or support or information or just have a little bit more time with someone. And then, once a month, we have a small team. There's only 12 of us. So we get together once a month and we have a review of how's the business going. And then there's an open section at the end of any questions about whether it's financials or strategy or customers or products or projects or people. We have those conversations there. So it's a combination of the one-on-one that's super open and yet confidential, and it creates that intimacy and that ability to maybe say hard things and have difficult conversations, with the group interaction where you can get the sense of, somebody else has got that same question I have, and can we solve it together? And when you have a question, it's like, that's great. Where do you think that might go? How could we move that forward? So that there's that openness. And we're in the middle of our annual strategic planning process right now, and we do those as a group. So there's certain pieces that leadership will take away and work on, but then we bring it back and we take lots and lots of input, using some right now with virtual online tools where everyone gets a voice to sort of say, what do they think we should be doing next and why? And how do we explore those ideas and decide which things get implemented and which don't? So that's some structure that we put around making sure we're taking input. And we do a pulse survey too. So I don't know how many of you have those, but we do the one we're using right now is Offenbacker. You get 5 questions once a week. And so we monitor, how are people feeling about the organization as a whole, about their manager, about, the environment we're creating. And it gives us some metrics to really say, because if people aren't coming forward, they might be willing to put an anonymous number. And then we're like, oh, this is slipping a bit. Maybe we should initiate a conversation about that and see what's going on.
And being able to measure that over time, right? And see
absolutely.
How shifts given the circumstances of the organization, of the broader.
So we saw an interesting dip around the pandemic when everything blew up and we had to reinvent all of our processes for staying connected. And then we saw that come back up. So this is one of the things we're looking for and going, okay, so how do we address this? Because obviously what we're doing right now is not working. We need to change it.
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but I know in my own company and in companies that I work with that have put these structures together and been very intentional about this, they say, we feel that we've weathered this pandemic and all the circumstances and the uncertainty in a better way, which sort of leads me to a question that I wanted us to explore a little bit. Okay, so we're in uncertain times. It's very difficult to make plans for 2 months from now, much less, a 3-year strategic plan, right? So how is this conversation that we're having interrelated to being able to address uncertainty? And Beth, I'd love to hear unmuted there. I'd love to hear you.
Well, we talk a lot about this in my emotional intelligence community. And so there are a lot of feelings going on underneath the hood, so to speak. And so I think what Laura just described with the pulse survey is a great way to get a handle on that in an organization. And you can look at a lot of other pieces. I mean, we're in the middle of what I call the big disruption. It is chaos on steroids, right? The old models don't work well anymore. And so this means we have to lean into and acknowledge all of those feelings and think about ways we can innovate And so, when it comes to inclusive leadership, I believe that this is about tapping into those emotions and transforming them in support of what really matters to us. And when we can do that and we can engage people and on the team, and I think I'll just say one other thing. I think the magic of being an inclusive leader is knowing what you don't know and seeking out other voices, even when it's really uncomfortable or it causes you to step outside your comfort zone, because that's where the learning is going to happen. That's where the creativity is going to happen. That's where the cool stuff is going to happen. And so if you're willing to go there, people will follow you and help you do really amazing things for our planet.
Nice. Thank you, Beth. And Steve, you've got an operating company. You got people out building homes out, in the world on a regular basis, and people with different skill sets and doing different things. I wonder if you can tell us how you address this with that.
Yeah, I think that maybe the last two questions you asked are somewhat converging in my mind. So the idea that, we've got this organizational question, like how do we best set up our organizations for success? And then we've got this uncertainty and this chaos. And I think from what I've seen, at least at Deltec, one of the tools that we've used to solve that is through what I would call decentralization. So, we're not a huge company, but we're 55, 60 people. And rather than having sort of a traditional, organizational structure where you have salespeople and you have customer service people, and, we sort of did away with that a few years ago. And we brought everybody into these smaller teams where it's cross-functional. And so, we've got these people who are now surrounding our customers with different areas of expertise as a team. And they're way better at solving uncertainty than we are as a big group because they're more nimble. So I think that's kind of what I was thinking about as y'all were talking about the uncertainty question. And, I think it also speaks to the other things we're talking about. It helps to build trust. It helps people to understand what their role is and how that role is going to affect the ultimate purpose of the organization. So it's a pretty deep topic, and I don't want to go on for forever about it, but that's kind of my 2 cents is the structure, decentralizing the structure really helps people to find their place and to make the difference that they can make.
Nice. Thanks, Steve. So in a couple minutes, we really want this to be an interactive conversation. So I hope that some folks will put some questions in the Q&A. We've got a couple already, but we're going to reserve some time for that. But before we go to the questions from the attendees, I do want to ask this question. Steve, you proposed this, and I thought it was a really great question. Where do you believe most leaders fail? And what are the missteps or most common for leaders at companies with a social and environmental mission? Like, where do we? And I've got lots of thoughts about this, and it's not just mission-driven companies, right? It's every organization. But yeah, I'm gonna turn it over to our experts, and because I'm excited to hear what. Rachel, you've interviewed thousands of people. Where do you see people failing?
Well, I will kind of go back to one thing that I'm always focused on is listening. So I think that one area that I see a great need for improvement among leaders is being an active listener and asking good questions. So those two things, I think they go hand in hand. And I think a lot of problems would be solved if people made that a priority. I'll stop there because I'm like, really, I love this question because I love hearing about failure, because I think failure helps us understand how to, learn from others' mistakes and how to transform bad things into something positive. So I'm really curious what Steve and Beth and Laura have to say about this topic, and I can certainly elaborate more on listening, but what do y'all think?
Awesome. Rachel, you're going to do a video about all of this with this. No, I'm just kidding. Give you an assignment. All right. Yeah. Who wants to chime in? Right. Beth?
Well, I think this is a really powerful question. I think it's different for each of us and where we are on the path. I think there's a different pitfall depending on all the things that have happened in our lives. So what my big failures are as a leader, I guess I'm hearing the question on two levels. Is it me wearing the organizational hat, or is it me as the leader? So I think about kind of my own, and I really do take a learning perspective. Like, everything is put before me because it's a chance for me to learn something about myself and how I can be more effective on all of the levels. On an organizational level, I mean, I will tell you, having run my company for more than 20 years, that I think the biggest failure I see is when people believe the title and they don't believe in their heart and what they're doing. That's where all the mistakes I've made have come from, where I get all bought into who other people think I should be and what I should be doing, and I'm not paying attention to my own work and why I started this organization and what's important about the work that we do. I'm curious to hear what others have to say.
That's really powerful, Beth. And I've made similar missteps in the past. Laura, how about you? Where do we fail?
Yeah, so the question was, where do leaders in general fail, and then there was what missteps are common for mission-driven companies. I think they're slightly different, because I think there's a slightly different kind of person that engages in this mission-driven, socially responsible organization. But I would agree with Beth on one thing: this learning culture is something that, particularly as you become more successful, or if you become successful too early. One of the things we forget is we fall in love with our first approach to things, and we stop learning that that's not always the right approach. And we think that we've been successful because we are awesome. And of course we are awesome, but at the same time, we're not perfect. And there's things that we need to learn and change and adjust as our environment changes. And sometimes the thing that we think made us successful is exactly the thing that kept us from being even more successful. And trying to relearn and self-examine, what am I doing well, and is still working well for me, and what are the things that I need to tweak or adjust and continue to learn. My most successful leaders, in my opinion, of success is those that continue to be humble and learn and be vulnerable throughout their careers at 70, 80 years old, and don't ever fall too much in love with their own press. Right. So I think that's one of the challenges. And I would say that, that's the title thing that Beth alluded to, is like, oh, I'm the whatever. I must be right about everything now because I've got this title. And I think the thing for these socially driven, mission-driven organizations, one of the challenges is making sure that we remember that we're in this as for-profit businesses, and not letting our hearts lead us too far and make our business fail because we're too kind, too unwilling to have the hard conversation, too unwilling to count the money and make sure that the business itself is succeeding. And I do see that sometimes because we act like we're not-for-profits, and the whole point is we're businesses. And so in order to achieve our mission, we have to have enough money to do so.
Yeah, thank you for that. One of my mantras with my clients is no money, no mission. And it's really important because it's easy to fall in love with what we're trying to create and accomplish in the world. Steve, this was your question. So I'm like, I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's been a fun one just to listen in on. Thank you all for sharing. It's the reason this question always comes to my mind is I had the fortune of working with an amazing mentor who wrote this book called How Executives Fail. His name is Lee Thayer. So I'll just throw that out there. If you're looking for a really interesting book, very different than most books you've probably ever read, he sort of goes through all the ways through these little vignettes and you see these people in your mind like, oh yeah, I know that person. I've seen that, or I am that person, even more likely. So if you want to learn more, I think that's a great way to do it. I think that what Laura said about what got me here is unlikely to get me there is a really powerful one. We do tend to get very single-minded in what we think makes us successful. So I would reiterate that. The one that I was going to throw out was I kind of also touched on a little bit is just the idea that I think leaders, the leaders that I work with in sort of the coaching groups that I'm a part of, we tend to be too nice, and we tend to give people too many opportunities. And I think it sort of goes to this idea we talked about at the beginning is we want to build the trust, we want to have the transparency, but at the same time, there's got to be competency and there's got to be accountability. There's this idea, I think it was Atul Gawande wrote it in a book. He's a surgeon, and he talks about how he, like, to help people, he has to cut on them. He has to open them up to help them. And so as a leader, sometimes you have to cut on people, and it doesn't feel good in the moment, but you know that you're doing that surgery for the future. So I think, thinking about how do we play the role that has to be played isn't always who we are, but it might be what the organization needs. And sometimes, that's counting the money. Sometimes that's having the hard conversations. I think that's the stuff that really helps leaders elevate to the next level.
Wow. Thank you so much for that.
If I can just respond.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Laura.
Steve, I totally agree with you. And often we're coaching leaders to assess their team. And we never want it to be easy to fire someone or demote someone or move them onto a different role, because we want that to hurt a little bit because we're partly to blame for putting them in that role. But we have to remember that they're not happy in that role and they're not successful either. And that we're moving them on and trying to think of that as a difficult kindness, I think is an interesting way to think about that. So thanks for bringing that up, Steve.
Yeah, and it's embedded in the system that I use, and there's this concept of get it, want it, capacity to do it, right? And like they're three very different questions, but really important to ask. And the other thing that came up for me when you were talking, Steve, was like, how do we, like, part of inclusive leadership is hearing from people, but then how do we allow failure from other people? Because I feel like that's one of the key mistakes that leaders make also, is not being willing to let go and holding on too tightly. And the message that ultimately sends to the team is one of a lack of trust. So again, it's this balance between, creating an environment where it's safe to experiment, and in an uncertain time, we need to keep innovating. So, all right. Thank you, guys. This is great so far. All right, so let's go to our questions. Phil Stone has asked, and I wish we could get Phil up here, but I guess I don't know how to do that. So I'm just going to ask this question. How would you define emergent leadership, and how does it differ from common definitions of leadership in a business culture? And I guess since I named it, I'll go first and say, to me, what emergent leadership means is being responsive and being flexible and adaptable. And then I'm going to stop talking and hear from others.
There's a great book that the faith leader in my faith community pointed me toward. It's called Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Marie Brown. It's got a social justice dimension to it. And I have to say, I really believe doing our personal work is important for us to then be able to do that work as leaders. So that's one resource that I'm immersed in right now that is really speaking to me around emergence and leadership. And I'll just say one other thing really quickly. I think that we are doing this panel a week or so after the U.S. elections. I think that's one of the things about democracy that I learned over the years. It's always being remade. It's constantly being remade to respond to the dynamics of our society and what our community needs. And so I think emergent leadership is around how do you do that, staying true to your values and what you're here to do as a business. But how do you keep constantly doing that? Because if you don't, your people are going to leave. They're bored. They aren't challenged. And you're probably going to stagnate as a business too.
Awesome. Thank you, Beth. All right. We want to just go around the horn here. How about Laura? You want what are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we think about leadership as not an authority-based position, but we think a leader-leader model where everyone leads from whatever position they're in. And that leadership is that ability to inspire and motivate both yourself and then others to reach towards, take action towards a goal, right? So, and I think emergent leadership and what's required right now is really, as Beth said very eloquently, to focus on your own values and how are you putting your values out into the world from wherever you sit in your organization. It's not just a title. You could be the receptionist or the janitor and lead from that position by influencing others to live their values and live those higher order values more effectively. So we really think about how do we enable everyone to have more positive, influential conversations, because leadership is a conversation, it's an interaction.
Yeah, I love that. And, Steve, Phil's asked a follow-on question is like, how does control change from an emergent leadership approach? And I wonder if you can respond to that and, how you operate your business. Because I agree. Also, it comes from, you got to lay the foundation, and you had talked about you're the steward. So.
Sorry, I'm looking at the question to make sure I understand it. How does control change? So I'm gonna back up a step, because I think maybe an important word that we haven't defined is leadership. Talking about this idea of emergent leadership, but let me just throw mine out there, because I think this is an important part of it. I don't think you can define emergent leadership without knowing what you mean by leadership. So for me, it's changing the trajectory of things for the better, right? That might be in somebody's life, that might be for your community, that might be for your business, but it's changing the trajectory. And there has to be a consequence. Something has to happen, in my view, for it to be considered leadership. It's not just you tried and you got a trophy. You had to do something. So if that's what leadership is, then I start to think about, and Maria, you sort of added this word emergent leadership, and I think it's a really interesting one. But to me, it gets at the point of it's somewhere in between, like we have total control over things and we have no control over things like our breathing. And so there's these things that just, we have some ability to direct. And I think the takeaway for me is it's really about who you are and how you think about things. And so for all of us to be able to lead a company, we first have to look inwards, and that's sort of come up already, but like, being in learning mode, like you all talked about, being curious and learning and thinking and changing who you are ultimately allows you to, I think, step into that role of leading in an emergent way, where you don't have to direct everything, but you have the team that understands kind of how they need to operate within the system that you've created. So it's a messy question, and I don't have an easy answer for it. And I think that's maybe another point that I'll leave everybody with is there is no recipe, and anybody that says there is probably trying to sell you something. So it's about who you are and how you think, and it's different in every case. So Phil's question about control, it's really hard to answer that without understanding, the set of circumstances that we're talking about in a particular case.
Okay.
Right.
Go ahead, Beth.
I just wanted to tie into Steve's great points. Yeah, it's really being the captain of the ship, right? The ocean is always changing around you. And if you don't pay attention to that, your ship is going down, right? And so how can you keep navigating to where you want to be? It's I'm sorry to mix metaphors, but it's like that old saying from Wayne Gretzky, play the puck to where you want it, to where it's going. I probably mangled that, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the captain of the ship metaphor and say, in my experience, there are times when you need to turn over the wheel to somebody else, right? Because maybe you're navigating waters that you have not navigated before. And again, going back on a personal level from, what got me here, is it going to get me there? And personally, and doing the personal work, and also from an organizational level. Like how I got the organization here may not get it where it needs to go. which leads sort of to this other question. What I love Beth or Rachel will respond if you're moved to, how do you effectively self-assess your own performance? I mean, how do you take that step back?
Yeah, I saw that question from Bruce and I was like, Bruce, that's such a good question. I wonder what the others think. I don't know. I think it's really hard for us to take an honest look at ourselves. It's hard to do that, and it's hard to see our blind spots. So I'm curious, I know that a common thing is to have other people evaluate you, right? So you're getting that feedback from other people who work closely with you. But I guess I would love to hear what others think, because I think this is like a very important thing to know how we are performing as leaders, and it can't, to some extent, come from within.
And so obviously there's the financial performance of an organization, right, is one way, but then how, and there's 360 reviews, things like that, which I have mixed feelings about, but how do you really honestly self-assess?
I'll just jump in really quickly, and I know I keep harping on the listening thing, but that's a topic for me that's like super.
Why I called on you, Rachel.
So one thing I've heard is if your goal, if you think I really want to improve my listening skills, you can have someone in a meeting kind of take score for you and say, okay, in this meeting, there's a great book by a guy named Bernard Ferrari, and I'll leave that in the chat. It's called Power Listening. He's the dean of I believe he's the dean of the business school at Johns Hopkins. And his goal in meetings is to listen 80% of the time and talk just 20% of the time, which is amazing, really hard to do. But I think if you kind of have a goal like that, you can have someone be your scorekeeper off to the side when you are in a meeting, and see how well that you're kind of meeting the standards that you set for yourself. And that would be one way to do it.
Yeah, and listening sincerely and with curiosity, right? And Laura, you're nodding your head. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Oh, I think Rachel's right on it with the listening. And I think that we often adopt a methodology from Marshall Goldsmith. He's one of my mentors, and he calls it feed forward. Mm-hmm. So instead of feedback, you do feed forward, and you go to a few individuals that you work with regularly, and you say, I'm working on my listening. What's one thing I could do differently to get better at listening? And you take notes, and you don't have a conversation about it. You just say, thank you for the feedback. And you go to the next one and you ask this, and then you look, is there a trend here? If 5 out of 6 people said that I talk and dominate the meetings, now I know what I need to work on, right? And it gives you some sense of, well, there's actually something here. And then I love Rachel's idea of having a spotter. We often talk about having a friend in the meeting that kind of gives you the signal, to let you know that you're going on too long without it totally embarrassing you in front of everyone, but someone who can give you feedback, or to afterwards say, I tried to do better in that meeting. How do you think I did? And then just listen and really be open to whatever they have to say. They're not right. They're not wrong. It's just their perspective. We take it as data points to help you improve yourself.
Yeah. I love that. And Beth, you're also nodding, which I think something's going off in your mind. I want to know what it is.
Well, I think that reflection is really important, and to be open to that and to be willing to hear the hard advice, the hard feedback is also really important. The points where I've really, really grown the most is when I've heard things. I'm thinking of someone I worked with recently on a project. I thought I was doing pretty well on it. And I got some feedback that I missed the mark in a couple of elements of it. And I was kind of surprised. And I thanked that person for being willing to say something, because it was in service to the project, to make sure the project went really well. It wasn't personal about me. We like to make it like that. But it was a real point of reflection. So when we can be open to hearing the things that are hard for us, that's a real gift. And I think to appreciate it and take it on board is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, with my clients, we set up intentional ways. I think, Laura, you mentioned earlier about having conversations, right? So it's regular conversations where there's tools where I'm going to ask, you know, every one of my direct reports to evaluate how am I doing in these different areas. And again, consistently over time, we're measuring, and if certain things continue to come up, then, you know, maybe I'm not taking the self-assessment. But Steve, I'd love to hear, do you have experience? How do you assess your own leadership?
I think the one thing I would add to what's already been said is, you know, find yourself a peer group, some other people that are in similar roles. You got to talk this out. I think sometimes with people who are not in your organization, it's helpful to ask, but I find that I don't always get the truest answer from people when I ask that question. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So what's been most fruitful for me is having some other CEOs that I get together with monthly, and we just talk about problems, and they don't have any issue telling me, well, that was stupid. And that's the kind of thing you need to hear, because you don't usually get it when you're in the leadership role. People just keep their mouth shut a lot of times, and that's not productive for the greater cause and purpose of the organization.
Well, I was going to say, it just brings us back to that vulnerability piece that we were talking about earlier, right?
I think how you respond to that negative feedback will determine whether or not you continue to get it. Because I think it's very easy to be defensive or like, but that's not true. We talk about sometimes how do you accept feedback and why is it so hard to take feedback? And if you're, you know, at all rejecting what's being said, it's so difficult for someone to, again, give you any more feedback. So they'll stop giving it. And again, they don't have to be right. You don't have to agree with what they're saying, but being able to take it in and assess and reflect and think, well, what part of that might be true? Even if I don't think what they said exactly was true. And, you know, I wasn't even in that meeting. Why do they say I talked too much? It's like, okay, calm down. It's like, in general, it seems they think you talk. Okay. So how can I work on that?
Yeah. Beth, you're an emotional intelligence expert. I would love your thoughts on, like, how do we make it safe for people to say the hard things to us?
Oh, wow. Well, you know, that goes to bringing our heart to the conversation, right? And connecting and respecting that. I mean, it took a lot of courage for probably somebody to say something that's difficult. And how do we find the gift in that? It's around that psychological safety that Laura talked about earlier, that nobody gets the right to be wrong. That's their perspective. And how can you be in relationship with that person? There's some really great tools in the Crucial Conversations books that have been published that talk about how do you create that environment and make it okay, make it safe for people to say difficult things, because sometimes those things have to be said.
Absolutely. So we are scheduled to have a mini keynote, but I believe we may be having some tech issues, and I can't believe that that's even possible. But so anyway, we're gonna continue answering some of these questions, and the next one on the list here, which is loaded, right? What is the best way to motivate? A trampoline over there behind me. Sometimes I jump up and down on that. But you know, that only works for some and repels some. But I'd love how do you motivate people? Truly motivate people. And I'm being facetious now, but.
I'll go out on a limb and be a little controversial and say you can't.
Agreed.
So you have to find people that have the competency that you're looking for. They can do the job, and you have to make it necessary for them to do it. The motivation's on them. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. Sometimes we're too nice, and we let those people stay at organizations if they can't play the role that they've been called to play. So I don't worry about motivating people. I worry about, how do we help people become more competent in their role? Because that's what makes life fun. Oh, I'm really good at this job. Now I want to do it. And I can see the difference it's making in the world. So that's my 2 cents.
So I would add my favorite resource on this is Daniel Pink's Drive. We talk about intrinsic and external motivation, and that as an employer of people, the most important thing we can do is provide them those intrinsic motivation factors, which is autonomy. Tell me what needs to get done, but don't micromanage me to do it. Mastery. I want to feel like I'm actually good at something, to Steve's point. So allow me to build skills and feel like I'm good. And then purpose, which is aligning to a bigger cause, which as socially responsible, mission-driven organizations is one of our key factors in attracting and retaining talent.
Awesome. All right. Patty has joined our stage, and yay. So Patty has worked across multiple sectors, and her company is Alpha People and Project Solutions, where she works with, she's coaching consultant with values-driven organizations. And what I loved about Patty's bio, the intro, was drawing on her greatest asset, her deeply lived experience as a successful woman who is both Latina and African American. She is passionate about supporting leaders and teams, I'm going to say, to become their best. All right. And with that, thank you, Patty.
Thanks, everyone. I'll keep an eye on the chat so that you can let me know if you've got good audio or not. And let's just go ahead and move forward. So thanking all of our panelists for talking about this really important topic. And everyone in the chat has been so thoughtful about processing through this and sharing. And I've heard vulnerability, transparency, stewardship, strategic approach, centering purpose over self, humility, honesty, and that there is no recipe, as we've just seen here. And I think all of these things are really pointing to what we're talking about when we say resilient leadership. When we talk about the grounding, the ability, the knowledge, the skills, and the aptitudes to move forward in uncertain times, as we've heard, with the complexity that we all face. If there's one thing that I know, after the years that I've worked in this field, after partnering with leader after leader and their teams, is that there are some key shifts that leaders make to build resilience and to build their creativity, their ability to create from their circumstances. So have you ever seen someone who have you ever seen two folks go through the same situation, the same circumstance, and one of them seems to be able to create from that circumstance. One seems to be able to navigate it much better than the other. And it's the same circumstances. So what makes the difference? The difference is really in the internal operating system, the way that we make meaning of the world and the way that we're able to operate. Once we grow out of our youth, the development is no longer about the body first. It's no longer about the physical structures either. Now it's about the development of our meaning-making system, our internal operating system. So resilient leaders, not only do they come from a place of being where they're grounded and they have purpose and they have direction and they center the whole, they do that by a mechanism of vertical development. They do that through the stretching that is sufficient enough to create the actual transformation, not just change, but reconfiguring our operating system. And the ability to now sit at a different place of perspective, a different place of ability, a different vantage point. So the main shifts that I see are around the being piece, right? The being over the doing. This morning, one of my mentors said that leadership is not a thing that we do, it's who we be, and that no truer words exist. It is our come from place. It is not a role. It is not a title. It's not a position. It is truly the journey of a lifetime. It is the purposeful endeavor to deploy yourself to a purpose that is greater than you. And so you can lead from any position, from any role, from any place. And I just really want to make that clear, that that part is so important to me. So now into the growing and the shifting. So now how do we get to where we're that person? How do we deal with the transparency? How do we implement the strategies to scale? How do we actually do and be this person that we're aspiring to be? Lost audio. Okay, Laura is letting me know that we've lost audio. Laura, is it back up? Okay, thank you. Wonderful, thank you. So how do we get to the implementation part, and how do we get to being in the long game, into doing the thing that we must do, the thing that we cannot not do? There's a shift that we're being called towards. And there's a transformation, a reconfiguration, an upgrade to our meaning-making senses that we're called to do. And I'm just going to slow down now and take a deep breath, because I feel myself teeter-tottering a little bit with the technology. And so I'm just going to take a minute to get my bearings and to get my grounding here, as we talk about going from problem-reacting mindsets to outcome-creating mindsets. And it's not just mindsets, it's the internal operating system. So problem-reacting is this crazy-making loop, cyclical process where we're reacting to a risk, a perceived problem, an issue where our identity is tied to that. And then we go into our reactive tendencies, then we're just on our back foot with that. And we continue to go through this cycle, which produces really inconsistent results over time. So, and all of us can really relate to being in that place, because truly that is a part of the developmental journey. And truly there are gifts even in our reactive tendencies. And yet part of our vertical development is really about moving more fully into the outcome creating operating system. And that is where you're purpose-driven, bigger purpose-driven, not cheesy, not woo-woo, but in the type of purpose-driven mentality and lifestyle that makes the connection between who you are, what you do, and the legacy that you leave. It is the thing that you cannot not do. The outcome creating meaning making system also looks for opportunity to create, looks for innovation, honors the being and the soul and the heart of every human being. So now I want to stop talking so much about this piece and take us through an exercise if we have some time. We have about 4 minutes. And I just want to interact with you all and our participants in the chat box here when we're talking about our vertical development. So there are certain tendencies that we fall into in general. We all react in different ways. We all have different response styles, but there are certain tendencies that we can fall into. And so the first I call leading from the head, and that's where our focus is on knowledge and expertise and contributing our subject matter expertise and our learning. And the second is what I call leading from will, right? Or we call leading from like that muscle, that sheer will, that determination. And that is really where we're performing, we're getting work done, we're powering through everything. And finally, leading from the heart space, where we're really concerned with relationship, or people, and what we want is to be in connection. So I just invite you to kind of think about where you land as primary with all of these styles, and to think about the gifts in those styles, the gifts in those tendencies, the power in them. And then when you have a moment and you're doing this reflection, is to now think about how every strength that is taken too far now becomes reactive. And so what are the shadow sides of those tendencies? How do they fail to serve our purpose in our teams, in our organizations? And this is the beginning for many of us of our vertical development. The world is ripe with opportunities for this development, and it's up to us to harness those opportunities and to make something out of them. And I charge all of us here and challenge all of us here to take what we're experiencing in this 2020 into the new decade that we're going into and use it for your vertical development. Use it for that. And I'll ask you to take a little time later to reflect on that exercise. Thanks everyone for hanging in there with so many little glitches and the other. I hope you've taken the nugget from this. I know that I'm taking a whole lot from it. So thanks everyone.